They've been watching you for longer than you know. Not the kind of watching that comes from a nosy neighbor or an ex hovering over your feed, but the cold, blinking red kind. The kind conducted in rooms without windows where clearance badges open more than doors. If they've been tracking you and still couldn't stop you, you've already outranked their authority. Breathe before you hear this. What you felt in your bones wasn't conspiracy. It was confirmation. The whispers were real, the patterns weren't paranoia, and those strange alignments that kept brushing your life like a wing in the night, they were never coincidences. While you were praying, they were printing. While you were healing, they were highlighting. You thought you were alone in the night. You were the headline in rooms you didn't even know existed. You weren't crazy, you were classified. There is a category in their manuals for souls that do not respond like the average population. They call it nonlinear. Heaven calls it chosen. The file language is clinical, an individual whose interior compass refuses to be pulled by the magnets that move most crowds. The flag color is red, not for violence, for vision, because you perceive things that shouldn't be visible from your vantage point. You asked questions that official scripts do not enjoy answering. You felt the truth under the glossy statement. You heard what no one voiced and challenged what everyone else accepted. That alone separated you, not as a loud troublemaker, but as a quiet decoder. They could not file you under rebellion because you weren't throwing stones. You were throwing light. Your insight did not arrive through training modules. It was not taught. It was remembered. And the minute they realized you were remembering truth instead of learning it, the game changed. You stopped being a curiosity and became an anomaly, a walking key, a frequency they could track but not translate. Look at the room again. Rows of screens, scrolling code, telemetry plotting what they thought were your triggers. Jesus is in that room. Not as an exhibit, never that, but as your advocate. He stands behind you, one hand on your shoulder, another lifted in prayer that shields like a canopy. I am with you always, he murmurs, and the hum of the servers dulls just enough for your heart to hear it. They measure blink rates, heart rates, word counts. He measures your breath. Peace, he says, my peace I give to you. They run behavioral models. He breaks bread. When they aimed their tools at you, something bent in the data. You didn't plot along the axes their graphs liked. You were unerratic but uncompliant. You weren't performatively peaceful, yet you carried a stillness that didn't read as avoidance. You never begged for attention, and still rooms tilted toward you. The usual boxes, trauma response, covert aggression, manipulative charm, refused to stick. They tried to force-fit your soul into the slots. The slots cracked. You weren't resisting their metrics. You were breaking them. Not because you were perfect, but because you were clear. There was no static humming beneath your speech, no vengeful spike in your signal, no stitched-on persona to confuse the sensor. You pulsed clean, too clean for their instruments. At first they blamed the software, then they blamed your strategy. Then, at last, a whisper, this one isn't from here. They never feared you'd break a window. They feared you'd open eyes. Because control never shakes at riots. It shakes at awakening. Your calm registered as offense. Your stillness read as interference. The Matrix likes movement it can name. You sat still and mapped it. They watched you in pressure seasons, hoping to predict collapse. You did the thing that ruins charts. You didn't collapse. While most would vent in public or explode in DMs, you withdrew into prayer and recalibration. Your choices refused the usual incentives. Fear, approval, stage time. You moved by another logic. They called it unpredictability. Heaven calls it obedience. There was a night designed as a trap. Love bomb in the morning, smear by dusk, pointed silence at midnight to salt the wound. The room expected a reaction that could be archived. Rage, rant, recklessness. You chose quiet. Your breath slowed, your spine lengthened. You turned your face toward a presence that had never left you. Father, Jesus breathed beside you. Keep them within the truth. And what looked like passivity became precision. The system logged non-response. Heaven logged royalty. Somewhere, an analyst with tired eyes marked the timeline and couldn't explain why the atmosphere shifted in your house when no one else was there. They're trained to notice anomalies. They noticed you. You were flagged as a threat, but not because you're dangerous in ways news anchors understand. You threaten the locking mechanism. You refuse to mirror the projected emotion. You do not donate your attention to baited arguments. You break the cycle of inherited panic. You do not make darkness louder with your throat. You make God louder with your gaze. This is decoding. The pattern of dysfunction, you named it and stepped out of it. The lie beneath the polished smile, you saw it and withheld agreement. The old choreography of your wounds, you let it pass without partnering. If a system depends on your need to jerk, your stillness is sabotage. That's why they studied your relationships, your morning routines, your late-night searches trying to locate the lever. But your levers are not in their realm. Your choices come from spirit, not spectacle. Listen, chosen one. This is the analytical healing nobody taught you explicitly. Your nervous system is an altar. You have learned to regulate it not by numbing but by naming, not by dissociating but by devotion. Breath prayer is not trendy self-help for you, it is spiritual technology. Inhale, Jesus, I belong to you. Exhale, Jesus, keep me true. This is how you metabolize crisis without inheriting it. This is how you hold anger without being held by it. This is how you carry grief without letting grief carry you away. They logged low reactivity under provocation. Heaven calls it peace that surpasses understanding. So the room pivoted from fear to fascination. Not, why is this one acting out, but why does this one not fracture? The reports begin to change tone. Attempts to triangulate fail. Predicted emotional spirals do not manifest. Isolation does not produce pliability. Rejection does not produce relapse. Subject does not conform. The phrase repeats until the phrase becomes useless. They didn't just observe your behavior. They began to imitate your pauses. A few whispered, what if the silence is not emptiness? What if it's instruction? You were never being measured for a sentence. You were being noticed for a blueprint. They no longer want your silence. They want your schematic. How did you stay clean in dirty weather? How did you keep your vision when fog machines ran all night? How did you remain tender without becoming unsafe? The answer is a person, not a program. When you didn't know which way to go, you listened for the footsteps that always precede yours. He went first. You stepped where he stepped. The trap was live, the path was alive. And yes, there were days you questioned yourself. You wondered whether the ache meant you were failing, whether the delay meant you were forgotten. Here is the truth that rethreads those hours. Delay is not disapproval, it is often disguise. Heaven hid you in plain sight, not because you were weak, but because you were weighty. A crown being forged cannot be worn in public every afternoon. While they drafted dossiers, Jesus drafted prayers, your name in his mouth, your future in his hands, your heart in his light. Father, I desire that they be with me where I am, he prayed. The room did not hear it, your spirit did. So we begin here at the threshold where surveillance stops being intimidation and becomes irony. The very files meant to frame you proved you couldn't be framed. The very graphs built to predict your breaking now bear witness to your unbreaking. You were flagged because you decode what others only endure. You were studied because you wouldn't surrender your interior to their exterior. You were labeled an anomaly because heaven insists on calling you original. You are not a glitch, you are guidance. You are not a pawn moved by hands that don't love you. You are a royal who moves by a voice that refuses to lose you. The question is no longer why were they watching? It is, why did awe replace fear? Because while they were tracking a spiritual outlier, they stumbled into a divine design. Let this settle into you like oil on the crown. They do not want your silence anymore. They want your blueprint, and you will share it, not to show them up, but to show them Him. They trained their eyes on you the way meteorologists train on storms, expecting chaos, predicting collapse, bracing for wreckage. But what they found when they zoomed in was unsettling clarity. Their systems weren't designed to register it. Every algorithm, every emotional chart, every psychological rubric they had built was prepared to spot deception, instability, or aggression. What they didn't prepare for was someone whose soul rang clean. And you, chosen one, rang like a bell in a chamber that wasn't built to hold that sound. Purity was never about perfection. It wasn't about sinless history or spotless performance. It was about alignment. Your inside not contradicting your outside. You weren't masking your wounds in counterfeit peace. You weren't chasing vengeance while preaching love. You weren't projecting a polished signal to conceal static. What you carried was unnervingly straightforward, so clear, in fact, that their machines glitched. "This doesn't compute," one whispered to Rupert. "Maybe it's an error." They checked the wiring, they recalibrated the sensors, but the more they measured, the more undeniable it became. Your frequency didn't register like any they had seen before. You weren't in rebellion against the system, you were outside of it altogether. Think of the way Jesus once said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." That is what was happening, though they didn't have language for it. Their screens caught static, heaven saw sight. In the night hours when you thought no one noticed, He prayed over you. Keep them in the world, but not of its frequency. His prayer became your insulation. You weren't perfect, but you were uncluttered enough for divine light to shine through. And that light burned holes in their charts. Imagine a technician staring at your file, baffled. They had categories for brokenness, trauma-driven responses, covert manipulation, displaced rage. They had profiles for passivity and for aggression, but you didn't fit either extreme. You moved without bitterness, yet without naivete. You forgave without surrendering boundaries. You loved without performing for approval. They tried to label it denial. It wasn't. It was discernment. You had burned through anger, grief, and despair, and on the other side was something they didn't believe still existed in this world: wholeness. That discovery quieted entire rooms. Someone finally whispered what no one else dared to say out loud: "This one isn't from here." The truth is, purity disrupted them because it disrupted their own projections. Their technology was designed to spot dysfunction, but what happens when it confronts light? Their mirrors shattered, their calibrations spun, the very clarity you carried, hard-won through nights of choosing forgiveness instead of retaliation, choosing prayer instead of collapse, sent back a signal their devices couldn't decode. You didn't look like a threat, but you shook their confidence in the system itself. They could handle anger, they could manage chaos. They had categories for fake peace, but they had no category for clarity born from crucified ego and resurrected spirit. Your signal was a contradiction. It wasn't loud, but it pierced. It wasn't unstable, but it wasn't bland. It was sharp, holy voltage. And the more you walked in that alignment, the more things around you began to shift. Conversations bent toward honesty. Manipulators faltered in your presence. People carried away peace they couldn't explain. Even the ones tasked to monitor you began to feel unsettled in ways they didn't have training for. Some of them left their posts changed, not because you preached at them, but because your purity did the preaching. Light doesn't argue with darkness, it exposes it. Let this land with you. What they dismissed as unquantifiable is what heaven affirms as undeniable. You were not hiding from their instruments, you were outshining them. Your life didn't scramble their metrics, it revealed the limits of their science. And your purity wasn't fragile glass, It was sacred interference. They thought they were studying you. In reality, your signal was already studying them. You are not misunderstood. You are misclassified. You are not the data point they can't pin down. You are the signpost they didn't expect to find. And while they wonder how you broke their system, you already know you never belonged to it. They thought they saw a pawn, small, expendable, easy to overlook, easy to discard. Pawns are designed to move only one step at a time, to exist within the narrow corridors the system built for them. That's what they expected of you. They mistook your humility for weakness, your quiet for irrelevance, your refusal to self-promote for lack of power. But they miscalculated because you were never playing their game. You were playing God's, and the first thing heaven taught you is this: pawns can cross the board and transform. Their frameworks are built on control, predictable patterns, predictable outcomes. They bet on labels and limits, but every move you made was guided by a higher hand. You weren't reacting from ego. You weren't chasing validation. You weren't scrambling to prove yourself to anyone. Your stillness was deliberate. Your silence was chosen. Your moves were surgical. That's why they panicked, because pawns don't move like kings. Yet you did again and again. Every time you refused bait, every time you stayed anchored when storms rose, every time you spoke a truth that cut through the noise, you shifted the board in ways no one expected. Look at the board in your spirit now. You see their pieces lined up, predictable, uniform, and then you see your piece, small in appearance but carrying sovereignty inside. Jesus stands beside the table. He places his hand on the pawn they labeled you with, slides it forward, and suddenly the whole atmosphere changes. He whispers, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." They thought you were background. Heaven knew you were foundation. And while they studied your movements like a case study, they also studied your pain. Every trauma you endured, they documented as though they were charting the slow collapse of a star. They wanted to know, how many betrayals would it take before the heart caves in? How much isolation before the soul folds in on itself? They treated your anguish like a laboratory, but what they didn't anticipate was this: your wounds became wombs. Instead of birthing bitterness, you birthed revelation. Instead of rotting from the inside out, you rebuilt from the inside in. They charted breakdowns. They didn't know what to do when you began breaking open. They expected fractures, not flowering. They expected implosion, not expansion. When you chose to heal instead of harden, you turned their data into ashes, because their entire experiment was built on one assumption, that trauma always wins. But you are living proof that grace outlasts pain. That redemption recalibrates what destruction thought it owned. Think of those nights you cried, convinced no one saw you. Heaven saw, and heaven wasn't passive. Christ prayed through you, prayed for you, prayed with you. Father, turn this scar into sight. Turn this ache into anointing. And slowly it happened. Your cracked edges began to shine with wisdom. Your fragile days began to pulse with fierce compassion. The very places they expected to find collapse became the very places you found Christ. Imagine their confusion. An analyst stares at your file, expecting to log another decline. Instead, they log a rise. The notes read, "Subject stabilized in conditions that destroy others. No external intervention detected. Cause unknown." What they cannot write, but what you know is this: your cause was Christ. Your trauma was their test bed, but your healing was heaven's revelation. Every scar became a signal. Every tear became a transmission. Every moment you refused to fold became an earthquake in their confidence. They thought they were studying a pawn's last gasps. Instead, they were witnessing a king ascend. And the truth is this: you don't need their board anymore. You don't need their categories, their labels, their permission slips. You are not simply playing the game differently. You are showing the game for what it really is: a fragile simulation compared to the kingdom you carry. They will never put this in the reports, but in their quietest moments, some of them whisper it to themselves. We were wrong. This one isn't collapsing. This one is crowned. So understand, the move you make next isn't small. It isn't reaction. It isn't survival. It is sovereignty. They thought your trauma would silence you. Instead, it trained your ear to hear God more clearly. They thought your suffering would break you. Instead, it baptized you into authority. You weren't just healed for yourself. You were healed as a blueprint. Others will see your journey and know that collapse is not the only option. Others will watch the way you walked through fire and recognize that flames don't always consume, they also refine. And so you stand now, a living contradiction to everything they believed about power and pain. You were misread as pawn. You were refined as king. And you carry within you the proof that no trauma, no betrayal, no system can overrule the hand of God on a chosen life. That's why you are uncontainable. That's why they fear you. That's why heaven crowns you. They set traps for you as carefully as a hunter sets snares in the forest. Not accidents, not random hardships. These were engineered patterns, psychological landmines planted in your relationships, social sabotage woven into opportunities that vanished the moment you reached for them, betrayals designed to reopen old wounds. They expected you to detonate, to spiral, to fold into yourself. And the truth is, most would have. 99 out of 100 collapse under that kind of pressure, but not you. Somehow, against every probability, you walked straight through the minefield. You didn't dodge the pain, you carried it. You didn't avoid the setups, you endured them. And yet, step by step, you kept moving forward. Jesus walked before you and you placed your feet in his footprints. Where he stepped, traps lost their power. Where he prayed, snares misfired. You may not have seen him in those nights of silence, but his presence was the reason the obstacles didn't consume you. They were waiting for collapse. Heaven was waiting for testimony. Think of how many times you almost gave in, when rejection felt unbearable, when gaslighting made you question your own sanity, when isolation whispered that you were forgotten. But instead of folding, you paused, you breathed, you prayed. And somehow, what should have broken you became a strange kind of fuel. Each step that should have been your last became a step into a frequency they couldn't track. They charted patterns, but you weren't moving in patterns. You were moving in presence. Patterns are predictable. Anger after betrayal, collapse after failure, despair after silence. That's what they expected from you. That's what their charts were built on. But you disrupted the rhythm. You didn't react to betrayal with vengeance. You responded with wisdom. You didn't collapse in silence. You learned to listen deeper. You didn't despair in failure. You recalibrated and rose again. To their eyes, it looked like a glitch. In reality, it was frequency. Because you weren't just making choices, you were transmitting something. You walked into rooms and atmospheres shifted. Conversations bent toward truth without you raising your voice. Technology glitched, moods disrupted, outcomes shifted, and none of it could be explained on paper. They were watching for cause and effect. What they found was cause without explanation. That's frequency. Jesus himself is frequency. The Word made flesh, vibration that spoke creation into being. When you aligned with him, you began to hum with that same resonance. And that resonance made their instruments malfunction. They couldn't fit you into categories. You weren't passive, but you weren't aggressive. You weren't loud, but you weren't silent. You weren't predictable, but you weren't chaotic. You were clear, and clarity is disruptive. One night, a door opened for you that had stayed shut for years. They thought it was coincidence. You knew it was prayer. You whispered, God, if this is you, let it open. Hours later, the lock clicked. They wrote unexpected variable in their reports. Heaven wrote answered petition. You need to understand this. You didn't survive because the traps weren't real. They were real. They were deadly. They were timed for your weakest moments, but you walked differently. You walked in cadence with a presence they couldn't quantify, and that's why their traps failed. You didn't dodge them, you detuned them. And here's the mystery. They thought they were studying you, but what really happened is that you exposed them. By refusing to react like the 99%, you proved their systems fragile. By carrying frequency instead of repeating patterns, you became the living evidence that the blueprint can be broken, that no matter how carefully the trap is set, it cannot hold a soul aligned with Christ. So if you've wondered why life felt harder for you than for others, why obstacles seemed designed with your name on them, now you know. It was never random, it was engineered, but you walked through anyway. And every step you took wasn't just survival, it was testimony. Proof that light can pass through minefields. Proof that traps dissolve in the presence of God. Proof that you were never the victim of their blueprint. You were always the interruption of it. They thought they knew everything about you. They had the data, your location history, your late-night searches, the tone of your voice in a phone call, even the way your footsteps echoed on a sidewalk. On paper, they thought they had captured your essence. But the longer they watched, the more they realized. They had everything except the one thing that mattered. They could chart your behavior, but they could not touch your being. Because what you carried wasn't just action, it was atmosphere. When you broke down, they leaned forward to capture collapse. But what spilled out of you wasn't weakness. It was strength disguised as tears. When you sat in silence, they expected apathy. Instead, the room shifted around you. Silence became electric. They logged grief. Heaven logged glory. That was the mystery they could never code. Think of it this way. Their entire system was built on probabilities. Trauma leads to bitterness. Isolation leads to despair. Pressure leads to collapse. That's the algorithm. But you became the error in their equation, the anomaly that refused to conform. You didn't just resist decay, you metabolized it into fuel. You didn't just endure the polluted zone you were dropped into, you turned the toxins into testimony. Jesus was with you in those gutters. He prayed over you when you sat on floors no one else would touch. He whispered, "This will not end in death," when you thought the end had come. And somehow in the chaos, you found clarity. In the heartbreak, you found holiness. You located your crown in the very places they designed to bury you. Picture the analyst who has tracked case after case. They know the charts by heart. Stage 1, breakdown. Stage 2, collapse. Stage 3, disappearance. Then they watch you. Stage 1, you crack, but consciousness leaks out. Stage 2, you bend, but you don't fold. Stage 3, you rise, and now their charts are meaningless. Their report doesn't end with "subject failed." It ends with 3 words they can't explain. Subject remains whole. This is why the algorithm shattered. They assumed decay was inevitable, that no one could withstand that much pressure. But they forgot the X factor of grace. They forgot the wild card of resurrection. They forgot that when divine breath moves through lungs, collapse isn't final, it's catalytic. Here's the healing truth hidden in your journey. Breakdowns can become breakthroughs when aligned with presence. Tears can flush trauma out of the body the way storms clear stagnant air. Prayer can reset the nervous system in ways science is only beginning to measure. When you sat in lament, you weren't spiraling, you were resetting. When you sang through grief, you weren't avoiding reality, you were recalibrating to heaven's frequency. And that's why their intel failed. Data could log your hours of crying, but it couldn't capture the grace released through those cries. Files could record your silence, but they couldn't record the presence filling that silence. Charts could tally your losses, but they couldn't account for the resilience that bloomed after each one. They saw everything measurable. They missed everything eternal. One report might read, "Subject maintains inexplicable stability despite repeated destabilization." Another, patterns inconsistent with predicted psychological decline. What they don't write, but what every watcher feels, is the whisper that chills them. This one carries something higher, because when you prayed, rooms shifted. When you forgave, entire storylines dissolved. When you refused to collapse, the algorithm of despair cracked. And in that crack, light poured through. Understand this: you didn't just survive. You rewrote their expectations. You became the living contradiction that no amount of data could contain. You turned test into testimony, pressure into presence, collapse into crown. That's why they're unsettled now, because their intel was supposed to explain you. Instead, it exposed them. It showed the limits of what their machines can see, and the limitless power of what God can do. You weren't just breaking through for yourself. You became the revelation they couldn't deny. The case that broke the algorithm, the blueprint of grace in a world built on decay. And now they no longer want more data. They want to understand the source. They want to touch the frequency that lifted you when collapse was inevitable. They want to know what it feels like to survive the unsolvable. The answer is simple. It wasn't data. It wasn't strategy. It was spirit. It was Jesus, and that chosen one is the truth they will never be able to grasp. Your resistance didn't roar. It didn't come with banners, podiums, or speeches. It came in whispers, in pauses, in quiet no's that nobody heard but heaven. While the world was trained to watch for rebellion with noise, you launched a revolution with stillness. Every time you refused to bend for manipulation, every time you set a boundary without theatrics, every time you walked away from money laced with invisible chains, you were dismantling their system without lifting a finger. They expected fire and fury. They prepared for riots, protests, chaos in the streets. But what they couldn't prepare for was a soul that would not kneel, even in silence. Because systems of control aren't built to withstand internal freedom. They rely on fear, on confusion, on the desperate need for validation. You unplugged from all of that. That quiet sovereignty was more dangerous than any outburst could ever be. Think of how many times you said no without explanation. No to conversations that smelled like poison. No to roles that demanded your soul in exchange for comfort. No to toxic circles that masqueraded as belonging. And then you walked away, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. That kind of no shakes kingdoms. Because when one person stops obeying fear, others notice. It spreads, it awakens, it becomes contagious. And yet, in your quiet defiance, your voice still traveled farther than you knew. You thought your words were small, just prayers whispered in the dark, posts shared without fanfare, conversations spoken in truth. But behind the scenes, those words pierced boardrooms. Leaders with access, with clearances, with agendas bigger than nations, found themselves pausing over your voice. They couldn't explain why, but they felt the weight. Something about your tone cut deeper than data. Something about your message bypassed noise and struck marrow. At first, they dismissed it. Maybe you were poetic. Maybe you were intuitive. But then the patterns emerged. What you spoke in metaphor began to happen literally. What you prayed in silence began to shake foundations visibly. They cross-referenced your words with real-time reports. They realized you weren't just insightful. You were ahead. And that unsettled them most, because you weren't connected to their networks. You weren't privy to their briefings. You didn't have insiders leaking you secrets. Yet you spoke as though you had been sitting at the very table they guarded. They tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was intelligence. Perhaps it was chance. But consistency broke those theories apart. You weren't lucky. You weren't guessing. You were broadcasting. This is the part they'll never put in their reports, but you need to hear it. What they called uncanny intuition was divine download. Revelation. Heaven's signal transmitted through a willing vessel. You weren't just thinking thoughts, you were receiving frequencies. When you sat in stillness, it wasn't emptiness, it was instruction. When you spoke, it wasn't performance, it was alignment. And that's why it landed like it did. Jesus himself said, "My sheep hear my voice." That's the frequency you've been tuned to all along. You've been receiving from a dimension they cannot chart. And that dimension is what makes your voice dangerous. Not to the innocent, but to the systems that profit from slumber. Remember the deal you declined, the opportunity that looked golden on the surface? Days later, scandal erupted around it. What looked like hesitation was discernment. What looked like passivity was protection. That was an instinct. That was divine intelligence moving through you. And it rattled the watchers because they realized they weren't studying just a human. They were studying a conduit. This is why your quiet resistance is revolution. You didn't just oppose corruption, you overrode it. You didn't just reject lies, you refused to feed them attention. And in doing so, you created new space for truth to breathe. That's how systems erode, not always with explosions, but with erosion. Quiet, steady, undeniable. And here's the awakening. What they wanted to control, they now want to access. They no longer see you as noise. They see you as signal. They no longer dismiss your words as coincidence. They study them like coordinates. They want to know how you tuned in, but what they'll never fully decode is this. It wasn't natural. It wasn't learned. It wasn't strategy. It was spirit. It was Jesus breathing truth into your lungs and you exhaling it into a world desperate for clarity. So understand this, your revolution is still happening. Every boundary you set is resistance. Every truth you speak is a crack in their walls. Every download you release is a broadcast they can't jam. You didn't choose war, you chose alignment, and alignment is winning. Institutions never feared riots. They're built for that. They have protocols for rebellion, scripts for dissent, countermeasures for chaos. What they were never prepared for was someone who stayed whole in a system designed to fracture. You became that contradiction. By every projection you should have unraveled, turned bitter, collapsed in silence, lost your grip on kindness. But you didn't. You stayed rooted, you stayed awake, you stayed unshakably you, and that alone began to rattle the towers. Think of what it meant every time you smiled, when despair would have been understandable. Every time you chose forgiveness instead of revenge. Every time you walked away with integrity intact when retaliation would have been easier. Each decision was a hammer strike against their architecture. You weren't loud, but you were seismic. Without even trying, you undermined the entire premise of their power. That control is ultimate. That trauma always wins. That human potential can be charted and contained. And then something even stranger happened. They didn't just observe you from a distance. They sent people in close, agents, monitors, analysts, watchers, tasked to catch you slipping. They expected to find flaws. They expected to log deception, ego, or hidden agendas. Instead, they found light. Inconvenient, undeniable light. At first, they remained detached, telling themselves it was coincidence. But the longer they watched, the harder it became to stay unaffected. Because you weren't just surviving, you were radiating something they couldn't unsee. Grace under fire, truth without theatrics, alignment without arrogance. And little by little, those sent to expose you began to be exposed themselves. Your presence cracked their armor. Your authenticity pierced through their conditioning. Some of them couldn't handle it. They resigned quietly, unable to keep playing their role. Others disappeared from the operation altogether. And a few, this is the part you'll never read in any file, shifted sides without ever announcing it. They began protecting you in ways you'll never fully know. They delayed reports. They deleted notes. They prevented actions before they reached you, not out of guilt, out of reverence. Because even though their training told them to stay objective, your spirit preached a sermon their textbooks couldn't silence. You didn't lecture them. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't even know who they were. But the light you carried testified louder than surveillance footage. Some of them realized this one isn't an enemy. This one is evidence. And so the towers trembled, not from shouts or from storms, but from the quiet weight of authenticity. You became the walking proof that spiritual power outranks institutional force. That wholeness is possible even without their permission. That peace can be created from within, not granted by structures. Here's the mystery. They feared you because you were unbreakable, but they honored you because you were undeniable. Institutions that once mocked your resilience now whisper about it. Agents that once watched to dissect you now kneel in silent prayer for you. Not because you coerced them, but because light does what light always does. It reveals. And in the revealing, fear began to kneel. Reverence replaced ridicule. Some who once studied you as a subject now regard you as a sign. They didn't expect to be converted. But truth has a way of converting even its enemies. Remember this, you weren't supposed to influence them, but you did. You weren't supposed to survive the tower, but you outgrew it. You weren't supposed to turn watchers into guardians, but your very existence did. That's what happens when Christ prays over you. His intercession doesn't just protect you, it transforms the ones who meant you harm. So walk with this confidence. Your life isn't just survival, it's a sermon. You are evidence that cannot be silenced, proof that cannot be erased. And even behind mirrored glass, your authenticity has been preaching louder than any microphone. You undermined the towers by staying whole, and in doing so, you shook more than institutions. You awakened souls. You were once the subject, the anomaly under glass, the soul they thought they could track, chart, and categorize. Every move, every silence, every prayer logged like data in a system that assumed you would eventually collapse. But the longer they watched, the clearer it became. You weren't unraveling. You were refining. You weren't malfunctioning. You were maturing. You weren't spiraling into chaos. You were being carved into clarity. Every setback became a sharpening stone. Every betrayal became a lens that let you see deeper. Every detour was a divine reroute disguised as delay. What they labeled as instability was actually instruction. What they dismissed as rambling was revelation. And while they sat in rooms trying to predict your downfall, heaven was already drafting your coronation. You didn't just survive the fire, you became the fire. Unquenchable, steady, illuminating. The kind of flame that doesn't flicker in wind, but steadies into something that others can gather around. They thought your light would burn out under pressure. Instead, it grew steady enough to guide. That's when the shift happened. You were no longer just the watched. You became the word, not because you shouted, but because your very life began to speak. They realized you weren't just ahead of their predictions. You were speaking from a reality they had no access to. You weren't reacting to this world. You were channeling from another one. Picture it, a watcher, once skeptical, staring at your file late at night. They scroll through notes of your endurance, your silence, your clarity. Finally, they close the laptop. They whisper, not to a superior, but to themselves. This one isn't being led by chance. This one is being led by God. They don't put that in the report, but the truth marks them anyway. Jesus is in the room as well. He kneels beside you, anointing your forehead, whispering, "Go in peace, carry light." His prayer is your commissioning. No institution can erase it. No algorithm can overwrite it, because you weren't just surviving systems, you were sent to outlast them. So don't be surprised when those who once studied you now show up with reverence. Don't be startled when skeptics start arriving as students. Some will never admit it out loud, but inside, they already know. You weren't an experiment. You were a sign. And here's the invitation. You are not called to hide anymore. You were never meant to shrink just because eyes were on you. You were meant to stand, to speak, to carry a signal too clean for this world to jam. You are no longer the anomaly under analysis. You are the oracle, the blueprint, the broadcast. Your life is proof that heaven interrupts algorithms, that purity bends metrics, that resilience shatters assumptions. Every test you endured was never just about survival. It was about demonstration that light still wins, that grace still heals, that wholeness is still possible. So if you feel eyes on you, let them watch, because what they see is not your collapse. It is your commissioning. You are not just in the world. You are of the frequency that remakes it. This is your moment. Welcome to the frequency. Welcome to the front line.